A conferência de hoje é aberta à nossa comunidade, se chama Women and the Modern Domestic Environment. Muito obrigada, Mary. Thank you, Mary, for being here. The mic is yours.
Obrigada. Thank you, Adriana. Today, I'm going to, I basically am addressing a question that the early historians, basically, that I talked about yesterday, Hildebrandt and Platz, gave an answer. And I'm going to give you a kind of expansion of their answer from the perspective of today, at least my perspective. I have in the subtitle, Furniture, Kitchens, Housing. I will deal with furniture more explicitly in my first lecture in Recife. So today I'll focus, I told you there was too many kitchens. I'll focus today on kitchens and housing and give you a little more background on that image I kept showing yesterday in the first day of Gretchen Lohotsky. Okay. Again, feel free to interrupt, and afterwards, as I said, only one talk today, and then the second part after a break, we can have a discussion, or if any of the students volunteer to lead the discussion or make any presentations, we'll follow with that. Okay, I'm starting off with this essay that I think I just put recommended, not required, by Linda Nochlin, which was groundbreaking and is responsible for my talk, in a way, my talk. In 1971, more than 50 years ago, Linda Nochlin wrote a brilliant and groundbreaking essay titled, just as you see here, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Her answer, as I'm sure many of you know, or at least assumed, was not that women lacked talent or perseverance, or any innate capacities that might allow for the creation of great art, but rather that it was social, economic, and institutional factors that made it impossible. Motherhood, housework, social obligations, the lack of training and mobility, all prevented women from having the experience, time, concentration required for serious artistic production. And until recently, we could have readily asked the same question about women architects and would have gotten an almost identical response. Today, however, I would like, as my title proposes, to ask a more positive question. How did women change or help change modern architecture? Which, as I said, those two early historians already in some ways answered. And more specifically, how did women change European modern architecture and design before World War II? However, in posing this question, I need to state at the onset two qualifications. First, that I won't fully answer my own question, but simply propose several areas where I think women's influence is most visible. Secondly, as you will probably have already noticed from my first two talks, I will frequently blur distinctions between design and architecture. And in fact, this was common still in the 1920s and 30s, as it was throughout the 19th century. For example, modern architects such as Alvar Aalto and Mark Stam designed furniture. Likewise, individuals who began as furniture designers, such as Gerrit Rietveld, Pierre Chareau, or Marcel Breuer, designed buildings. And that was even in the case of Le Corbusier, who, when he had his early training, it was in the decorative arts. And even though he later couldn't seem to design modern furniture, in the teens, he did. In the case of women, this blurring of boundaries between the two fields is even more evident. Like many of the most renowned European women designers, architects of the period, Eileen Gray, Charlotte Perriand, Lily Reich, studied the decorative or fine arts before attempting architecture. Not surprisingly, given that many schools in Europe did not accept women until after World War I. For example, the first French woman did not graduate in architecture from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris until 1923. And it was not until the late 1930s, in fact, that the first women received architectural degrees in Spain and Italy. And I gather in Portugal, it was not until the 40s, even later. So I gather in Brazil it was earlier. So that in itself is interesting, but we can talk about that later. For years, the coupling of women designers with modern architecture was regarded more often than not as a contradiction in terms. The revered heroes of the European modern movement were all men. Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. So too were most of the seemingly secondary players, including their kind of male image of the modern movement, but I thought I had images of these secondary figures, J.P. Aud, André Lersa, Giuseppe Tirani, those people that we sort of discovered post-Gideon, they were all male. The very image of the self-assured genius breaking with conventions and academic styles was invariably male. Much contemporary theory, even that written from a feminist perspective, has reinforced this ingrained perception of modernism as male. Autonomous, pure, austere, the privileged realm of male activities, that is design. In contrast, as I mentioned yesterday, mass culture was almost always seen as female, commercial, impure, and inferior. In other words, high art is male, entertainment female. However persuasive this argument might be for literature and other cultural forms, and I have my doubts really about that too, it is only partially true for architecture. If the machine imagery of Le Corbusier's Vers une Architecture of 1923 still perpetuated the masculine biases of modernism, other dimensions of modern architecture, its emphasis on domesticity, its social agenda, and the formal challenges to traditional gender conventions, its emphasis on domesticity, suggests a more complex story. One that I hope to show gives a more substantial role to women as a source of both inspiration and as creator. As feminist scholarship since the 1970s has shown, women were actively engaged in European architecture between the wars, despite considerable social and institutional obstacles. And here are, portraits of some of the women I've already mentioned, like Eileen Gray, Lily Reich, and Ino Alto. All that were, as I've said earlier, excluded from many of the early modern the modern architectural histories post-1940s, such as Siegfried Gideon's and Rainer Banham's. But I would also like to cite in passing other important women designers whose names were largely unfamiliar and deserve to be better known, some of whom I've mentioned before, such as Marlene Polzig. Here's some images. Elsa Godoni, who worked in Israel and the US, Helena Sirkis, whom I mentioned earlier, in Poland, Lotte Cohen, again in Israel, Ingrid Wahlberg in Sweden, and Leonie Gossendorf, who really had a very large practice there, especially in the 50s. And there are so many more I might mention, and we also have referred to the Brazilian women who are active. In contrast to some of our assumptions, women's role in modern architecture, as we've already seen, was widely acknowledged. And I'm going to just skip through these slides since I gave much of this yesterday, and I forgot to admit them. And I'll start today with my focus on kitchens and housing. But basically, I want to propose that the focus on domesticity and housing in modern architecture offered women new opportunities for participation in the profession, and that they in turn helped shape these concerns. Certainly more than their male peers, women designers were acutely aware of the need for reform. As late as 1939, British activist Marjorie Spring Rice, she's someone we need to know more about, lamented, quote, excuse me, domestic slavery of mind and body of the millions with whom rests the immediate care of a home and family. And this phrase, domestic slavery, was common in this era. Women were seen as tied, forced into these roles, taking care of their families. Women, I suggest, brought a new array of interests and skills to this arena, whether from personal experience or their previous training in the decorative arts, or even their active engagement in this domestic reform movement. And they tackled all scales of domestic design, including household objects and furnishings, more about that in my later lecture, kitchens and room arrangements, and urban apartment blocks. In trying to outline this contribution of women to modern architecture, as I said, I'm going to be focusing on 3 scales, saving furniture for later, of domestic architecture: furniture, kitchens, and housing. And in each case, I shall focus primarily on the work of one designer. Although the sources of women's innovation vary considerably, I would like to emphasize 3 factors in women's experience that seem especially relevant to their contributions. First, their decorative arts training for furniture and interior design. So here, the fact that their education isn't conventional in architecture, I think, is highly important. The second is that domestic reform movement that I keep mentioning, and you'll see more about that, including household rationalization. But a third factor that I haven't mentioned so far, women's long-standing engagement with social and charity work, which was especially important for their role in housing. Now to kitchens, domestic reform, and household rationalization. And there is probably no arena in which women had as much influence in modern architecture as the kitchen. And Monica's comments yesterday really underscored that for Le Corbusier. For centuries, architects ignored the kitchen as a subject of design. It was considered a utilitarian space, one primarily for servants and housewives. By the late 1920s and 30s, and this is apparent in Gropius's house for himself, the master's house, and his wife, Isa, this changed dramatically. Architecture exhibitions also featured model kitchens. Professional magazines published articles on kitchen design, and architects included photographs of kitchens in their own work. You see here Alvar and Ino Alto's kitchen, primarily designed, of course, by Ino. Not their own kitchen, but that for Villa Maria, one of their most important commissions of the late 1930s, as an example. And I've already mentioned this, but the importance of the American domestic reform movement and its impact on Europe was all important. It was led, I would like to stress, by middle-class women. Their interest had been sparked by various factors, including the pre-war women's movement, the so-called servant crisis, which everybody talked about after World War I, and the growing promotion of rationalization in industry, which hit Europe a bit later than the US, but was certainly present in Germany by World War I, came to France, first in the automobile industry, but more in the 1920s. Following the example of Americans such as Catherine Beecher, you're going to get tired of this image, but even more important, here her drawings, but more important, as I've said earlier, Christine Friedrich, and another important women household reformer, Lillian Galbraith, in the early 20th century. And these reformers all just wrote books, campaigned, gave lectures, all arguing for the rationalization of housework, to apply the principles used in industry to streamline production to the running of the home. Following the ideas first of the American industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Homer. And these women reformers argued that housework actually should gain professional stature and respectability. So instead of seeing it as slavery, it should be taken as a profession in its own terms. The European domestic reform movement had its earliest and strongest role or impetus in Germany. In 1921, someone named Irina Witte translated Frederick's book, New Housekeeping Efficiency Studies in Home Management, 1913, not a very romantic title, really emphasizing this professional scientific dimension, into German. And this may have inspired Benetta Ote's kitchen for the Bauhaus House on Horn that I showed later. Yesterday, in fact, as well as Bruno Taut's book that I also showed yesterday, where, called The New Home, subtitle Women as Creator. And in 1929, there's no doubt that, 1926, when Erna Meyer published her book, The New Household, which went into, you can't believe this, 29 editions in 2 years. It was a bestseller. Clearly this was a topic that touched a lot of women, maybe even a few men, on how life had to change. Her book was soon translated, and the Dutch edition was very popular, and was followed by numerous studies of household management in the Netherlands, France, Finland, England, and Italy, including, here's some more images from Erna Meyer showing her practical solutions for household reform. And here's the example in Italy by Lydia Morelli, I mentioned her, whose book also had a tremendous influence there, publishing once again Christina Friedrich's diagram. Frederick had insisted that kitchens should be used strictly for preparing of food or clearing away, and proposed the grouping of related activities and continuous work surfaces at correct height and proper lighting and ventilation as necessary reforms for the kitchen. Many of the young European women designers, including Ino Elto, Lily Reich, here's her drawing of an image I showed you earlier, the photograph, and a Finnish woman that we need to learn more about, were all influenced by Frederick's ideas and the reform movement in general. The Finnish woman was Salimi Setala, and they all embraced these ideas and proposed model kitchens. If anyone knows more about Salmi Setala, I'm probably mispronouncing her name, please let me know. I've been trying desperately to find images of her, more examples of her writing. I keep hearing her name mentioned, but I know very little about her. In fact, I would just mention, it's very hard to find images or portraits of some of these early women designers. The most famous of the model kitchens was already the one, here's Lily Wright, the photo I showed you earlier. The most famous designer of the prefabricated question was, without doubt, Gret Lohotsky. Oops, did I turn it off by accident or anything? Is it still all working? Oh, okay, I have to talk closer to the mic, sorry. Was Gret Lohotsky. First Lohotsky, when she designed, she got married in the process of working in Frankfurt. He was working under the auspices of Frankfurt's municipal building department, headed by Ernst May. The Frankfurt kitchen was one of the first fitted, was the word they used, European kitchens. It came complete with stove, sink, built-in cabinets. What distinguished it most from other kitchen designs was its wide-scale production. Approximately 10,000 units were installed in 4 years in the newly built settlements in Frankfurt alone. It was serially produced. I hesitate to use the word mass production because it was produced not like Henry Ford's cars in runs of 100 or 300 or even 1,000. It was produced in sort of units of 10. But the fact that there were 10,000 units produced was absolutely outstanding by European standards of the time. And it really became a model for European modern architects, both men and women, in the interwar period. Lohotsky's interest in kitchen design dates back to the early 20s, before the Frankfurt kitchen, when she began working with Adolf Loos in the Viennese housing office. She herself was Austrian, one of the very first women to graduate from architecture school in Austria. Here, she studied kitchens as part of her research on low-cost housing and proposed, I find this kind of amusing, a concrete kitchen made of concrete, which was to be factory assembled and mounted by crane. There you can see the concrete counter in this image of this early Austrian kitchen. Ernst May was impressed with her work in Vienna, and when he visited Vienna, shortly after he was appointed city architect of Frankfurt in 1925, he invited Gret Lohotsky to join his team of architects. And there's a sort of interesting, fun anecdote, which could well be true. When he wanted to convince Gret Lohotsky to join his team in Frankfurt to change countries, he asked the young but experienced designer how much money she would like to earn. And then she gave a figure, and he promptly doubled the amount she specified, hoping to convince her to come. She did. In Frankfurt, as in Vienna, she was deeply committed to providing functional, comfortable, affordable housing to thousands of workers. But her ambition, like May's, was broader, to create what they called a new Wohnkultur, a new living culture, with health, sports, and other leisure activities available to all. Architecture, including her functional kitchen, was a means towards a fuller and more egalitarian life. And the descriptions of this life are very much part of the magazine and publicity they offered, this magazine Das Neue Frankfurt, that was actually quite widely disseminated in Europe, especially in Italy, as we've discovered. And it really promoted a kind of whole vision of modern living, that the kitchen is really only one part, but an important part, especially for women. Her primary goal in designing the kitchen was to reduce women's labor and ensure physical comfort. Besides warding off stress-inducing drudgery, Lohotsky considered the kitchen a step towards women's self-development, which, contrary to the pervasive rhetoric at the time, she placed before, quote, the family as a whole. But she made no mention of women's special nurturing and aesthetic roles along the lines of Swedish reformer Ellen Key, or even, quote, the new pleasures or the joyful creativity that Erna Meyer believed would ensure the rationalization of the household. In other words, she's not really doing it to promote motherhood or happier families, but actually to promote women's own self-fulfillment. Undoubtedly, Lohotsky viewed cooking and cleaning as necessary chores, and she admitted that she rarely cooked in later interviews. Ones that in her time were without question the burden of the housewife. And I think we always have to think about this double problem, if you will, that at one moment the interest in the kitchens reinforced women's traditional role in the household, but on the other, at that moment in time, there was just no question of men doing part of the cooking or cleaning up, unless they were really, really exceptional. And I can't tell you, I haven't run into too many of those in the interwar period. To assume otherwise in 1926 would have been utopian. In 1921, in Mai's magazine, this is an earlier magazine of Mai, she had declared, quote, first, life is work, and second, it is relaxing, company, pleasures. The kitchen was for work, the more spacious living room for pleasure. Segregating the two would eliminate disturbing noises and smells in spaces used for relaxation. Before designing the kitchen, Lohotsky did numerous studies of cooking movements and circulation patterns in order to determine the most efficient arrangement for equipment and utensils. And some of these are her early study sketches of the kitchen. By the way, there's a wonderful exhibition on right now in New York from the Viennese archives of her drawings. Here I'm showing you rough sketches, but she had a wonderful hand and also did some very beautiful sort of poetic drawings. As models for the design, but notice too the careful numbers and figuring out on the sketches. These aren't just rough design ideas, these are actual careful studies. As models, she looked at professional cooking spaces intended for men, such as ship galleys and railroad kitchens, compact spaces where one or two people could cook for hundreds. In addition, she studied closely Witta's translation of Frederick's New Housekeeping, which she later described as her Bible. And I talked to Laura Kramer, who knew her, and said that Lohotsky had actually said that she had Witta's translation on her drawing board as something she constantly consulted as she was designing the kitchen. However, unlike Frederick, Lohotsky also sought to extend rationalization to construction, and I think that's an important difference. She conceived the kitchen as one unit that would be serially produced to reduce costs, as I said, and thus made affordable to as many as possible. And to attain this goal, she worked closely with the industrial manufacturer, George Grumbach, and several women's groups, constantly wanting to have feedback from women about what was important to them. An entire unit cost approximately $50. I don't know what that means in current terms, whereas the individual components, if purchased separately, would have cost about $90. So it was almost half the cost as if they had been bought individually. There's some debate about this cost factor. I think she really meant it for working class and lower middle class women. But there have been stories that just to use these new appliances, including electricity, was too expensive for some of the working class women. Luhotsky proposed not just that famous Frankfurt kitchen, which you see in the skinny model there. She proposed 3 models of kitchens. I show you the bigger one there. 2 larger ones intended to accommodate 1 or 2 servants, and 1 smaller unit. Type 1, the renowned Frankfurt kitchen, which was the cheapest and by far the most popular of the 3. Depending on the housing complex and the orientation of the apartment, minor variations of the layouts were possible. And this flexibility was actually made possible by those small production runs I just mentioned, 13, 15 units at a time. And each one of these units was worked out in precise detail. She kept the Type 1 galley kitchen intentionally very compact. It was about 9 meters by 3.44 meters, so that several tasks could be completed while sitting on a pivoting stool at the end, simply by extending one hand. Thus, all the equipment for cooking preparation and cleaning up, the cutting board, cold storage box, it's before modern refrigerators, you still used ice cubes, double sink, drainage board, and cooking utensils were grouped together at one end of the kitchen near the exterior window. And you see the pivoting stool there. Her idea was that women could sit on that stool and do all those activities without having to get up. Although the technology was kept modest to minimize costs, Luhotsky introduced a series of very practical devices, including a removable waste drawer below the cutting board for any vegetable scraps, so you could just brush off your scraps into this drawer, a wooden plate rack attached to the underside of a cabinet for dishes to drip dry. There were no, washing dishwashers and dryers at that with drying units at that moment, and a special set of aluminum canister drawers that have pouring spouts and measuring bars for easy usage. And you see them on your right in the lower cabinet. Do any of you have any ideas what were problematic about those drawers? The idea was you could just pull out a drawer with flour in it, and because it was designed to pour, you could just pour it into a measuring cup and eliminate a bowl or whatever. What might be a difficulty? She later had to move these drawers. Any ideas?
Bugs?
What?
Bugs?
No, they were pretty seal-proof. She was worried about bugs. I'll mention this later. She, in fact, looked at studies on what color paint was best for deferring bugs. And they decided it was a blue-gray in Germany, something North African vernacular architecture had already kind of discovered. If you go to, I went to the Mzab in Algeria, and lots of the fronts of entries to houses and stuff are painted blue, supposedly to deter bugs. No, I don't think it was primarily bugs. Any other ideas?
Industrial products. The things work like more in powders that they came in cans. I don't know.
Well, she managed somehow to get these industrially produced out of aluminum. No, the problem was little kids. And maybe it took she didn't have any children yet at that point, but they thought they were the greatest toys for playing, and they'd pull them out and spill the flour. And there was one, and so she had to later move the drawers up higher in her later runs of the kitchens. There was one other problem. Any other ideas? She made them all the same size. Do you have any other thoughts on this?
Pets.
What?
Pets.
What?
Pets.
Pets. Well, pets, I don't think could really get into the drawers. But, you know, who knows, if you had a really good pet, as a cat, perhaps they could do something. No, it was that she didn't accommodate the fact that different amounts of food require different sizes. So the women all complained that there weren't enough, the drawer size was much too small for potatoes or cabbages, but you know, it was fine for flowers or split peas. So there was a kind of idea of standardization that didn't quite work with reality. And I think we have to realize that many of these early experiments were just that. They hadn't worked out all the, excuse my double entendre, bugs in the design of the drawer system. But nonetheless, it was a great idea and very kind of appealing aesthetically. Oh, well, back to the image for a moment. Two other notable features were an insulated cooking box, which the household wife could use for slow cooking. This is long before those crock pots, or I don't know what the name of the modern device is for slow cooking. She decided that you could use the heat from the stove to keep warm for those women who were working. They could prepare the meal before they go to work and put it in this insulated heat box so that it didn't require as much reheating when they returned home to prepare dinner or while they did other household chores. There was also a hanging lamp that could be moved along a metal rack, which you don't probably know, but maybe have some idea how expensive electricity was at this moment in post-World War I Weimar Germany. And so to have two lamps would have been virtually impossible. So you could move the lamp to save for lighting. There was also, one of my favorite features was the folding, let's see if we could go back, ironing board. I don't know if you can really see it. On the left at the back by the window, you could sit still on that pivoting stool, push the ironing board down, and use the electricity provided in the kitchen, or else just heat the iron on the stove, which was probably more common in those days, to iron the clothes. There are those famous aluminum drawers that the children like to play with. Lahotsky's aesthetic choices, glass cabinet panes, aluminum sinks and drawers, tiled floors and splashboard, sometimes linoleum floor rather than tiled floor, and counter space, all reinforce this image of an efficient, hygienic workspace. In the iconic photo of the kitchen, the floor and linoleum countertop are black. The Roberts fabric walls, she used a kind of waterproof, you could clean wallpaper, and stove hood were white. The most popular color for the wooden frames of the cabinet doors was this grayish blue I just mentioned, especially chosen to repel flies. However, the enameled wooden cabinetry and framing, this overall image seemed modest, almost primitive, compared to the kitchens designed a few years later, one of which I'll show you in my next lecture. By the way, many of these kitchens are still in use and seem to still work very well, with now substituting modern appliances and sometimes painted different colors. However, I wonder how long that's going to last, because now that her name is well known, museums have suddenly decided they need to purchase Frankfurt kitchens. So one by one, residents are selling them off to various museums, which happened in the Museum of Modern Art, just when I was writing an article for the MoMA book, Modern Women. Public reaction to the Frankfurt kitchen was varied. Most modern architects and critics praised it, as did many housewives, for its efficiency. Here's an image, by the way, of one of them I saw recently in Frankfurt today. Still with the low drawers. And the efficiency side was part of the publicity that and his whole team, it was really a collective effort. I can't stress that enough. They did this movie showing women at work, just like modern industrial studies, to show how efficient the kitchen was. There was also a film. A government report on kitchen design cited the Frankfurt kitchen as the best solution up to that time for those without servants. It was also widely celebrated in the press and popular culture. There was even a song written in Lohotzky's honor. If you can read German, there's the song. And cartoons were done of her. I mean, she was a kind of, rock star in Germany in the late 20s, this amazing woman who made life so much simpler. However, the kitchen reformer, Erna Meyer, whom I've talked about, criticized it for being too rigid and too narrow, at least the Model 1, for 2 people. Meyer's own roomier kitchen designs at Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart in 1927, one of which she designed with Hilda Zimmermann, the other in a collaboration with J.P. Aud, can be viewed as direct responses to Lohotzky's model. But I might mention they too were concerned with a window over the counter where you worked. Any ideas why you wanted a window over the counter to work besides light? Yes, watch the kids. So the idea was women, of course, multitasking. Someone said it was much more than a double shift. It's like a 5-person in 5 shifts. These women, children were out to play, but you could watch them while you cooked. Other complaints, there was still a debate too, I don't want to get into this too much, about the living kitchen versus the work kitchen. The living kitchen, the Wohnküche, was the country model where you ate in the kitchen and the whole family gathered. It was decided in Frankfurt that that was a problem because of ventilation, smells, etc. And Schutt Lohotzky went along with that program. Later, she said, with ventilation and modern fumes, etc., the Wohnküche made sense. But I think you should know that it wasn't clear at that time, that there was a huge debate at the moment. But no matter how one, and then later in the 80s, a new generation and feminists in Germany would criticize the Frankfurt kitchen for segregating women and not sufficiently accommodating the creative dimensions of housework. Lohotzky herself rejected that assessment. By the way, she lived to something like 103 and was still dancing at her 100th birthday party. She was a kind of amazing woman. I could get into her biography, but also someone who was jailed for protest for her efforts to basically get rid of Hitler in Austria during World War II. But back to the kitchen. She argued in a later assessment when feminists were saying she downplayed the creativity of cooking and housework, that the elimination of labor, regardless of who was cooking, was beneficial. In fact, it could make cooking more creative. She also raised the issue whether the dissolution of sex-specific practices of role behavior, and I think this is an important quote of hers, can be expected to result in any way from such an architectural spatial transformation. So I think this is a question for us Can we really expect architecture to change social mores or not? To what extent do they help or not? It's something we can really debate, think about, even argue about. How determinist is architecture or not? But no matter how one views the kitchen, as inadvertently regressive in reinforcing women's traditional role as housewife, or as progressive in allowing women more time for other activities, including employment, Lohutsky and Meyer's designs represented a break with gender stereotypes and traditional images of domesticity. And I've kind of alluded to this before. Like the domestic reform movement in general, they helped undermine long-standing assumptions that rationality, efficiency, and modernization were male values. And inversely, the decoration, emotion, and coziness were essential qualities in women's spaces. I also think in terms of architecture, Lohutsky and reformers like Meyer and Witte can be seen as extending the domain of architecture itself to include domestic service spaces that, as I said, had been ignored by male architects in the past. The influence of their efforts was felt almost immediately throughout Europe. In France, for example, Paulette Bernège, a recent philosophy graduate, actively took up the campaign for domestic reform with 2 publications in 1928, Household Management and If Women Made Houses, the latter illustrated with delightful sketches. I'll go back to this later, but I think it's worth showing. Can anyone read the French in the captions? No? Otherwise, I can say, give you a summary. They're very funny. The one with the Eiffel Tower says, if you climb a stair 5 times a day for 40 years, it's the equivalent of raising 9 million kilos of the Tour Eiffel to the height of 2.5 meters. Have no idea where she got this statistic, but she's really arguing about the inefficient design of most houses. When women, sometimes in traditional French houses, the kitchen would be on another floor, even from the dining room, and the idea was the servants brought the food up and down. No more servants, the housewife's bringing the food up and down. Not that it was good for the servants either. And the other one, which is very funny, is she says, this is typical, very awkward design of Haussmannian apartment blocks. She said the distance between the kitchen, again intended for the servant in old designs, was the distance after so long, so many years. How many years did she say? She doesn't say, after 40 years again. Walking between Paris and Lake Baikal in Manchuria. So back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room was this endless, fatiguing journey. So basically, she brings humor to these studies of rationalization. Kitchen design was a major concern for her, and she again had the challenge of these weird Haussmannian blocks hitting boulevards. How do you make a rational triangular kitchen? And she published her studies in architectural magazines like Technique et Architecture or the magazine L'Architecture before Technique et Architecture. I could go into this more, but she was also a friend of Le Corbusier's, invited him to congresses. He invited her to the CM 1929 in Frankfurt on the Minimal House, where he himself did not attend. And I'll go back to this when I talk about Perriand next week. I'm going to skip this for now. By the early 1930s, male architects as diverse as Walter Gropius, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, Hugo Haring, and Rob Millay-Stevens were all designing kitchens. In other words, these early women kitchen designers made men change their own roles. And there was probably no image that was published quite so much as this one image of Millay-Stevens for a very lavish villa. I don't know if you know Villa Carrois by Millay-Stevens. It was for a rich family, but he put a lot of attention and energy into the kitchen design, and it was publicized all over the place in France. And basically, we no longer had it dismissed as a subject of design. And although there were limits to how much rationalization could improve the daily lot of women, and certainly it did not resolve the gender division of labor in women's double or multiple shift, the very recognition that household drudgery was oppressive to women, including servants and housewives, that domestic space required modernization, undoubtedly encouraged, I would like to propose, a social climate that would lead to later reform. So what I'm trying to suggest is that these images that clearly weren't widespread, they didn't touch all households, but they set a standard, a kind of model that would really take hold post-World War II. But the imagery, the ideas were already there in the interwar period. Okay. How are we doing? Okay. So the second issue I want to talk about today is housing and the role of women as housing reformers and their goal in housing reform, not just to rationalize the household, but to allow women what I'm calling as public citizens. That there was a role not just to reform their drudgery, but to give them other options. Women's interest in the transformation of the domestic realm extended beyond furniture in the kitchen, arenas that might be seen as almost natural extensions of women's traditional role, to housing at a larger scale. Charlotte Perriand designed the residential units for Le Corbusier's Ville-Radieuse in Algiers plan. Lohotsky worked in both Vienna and Frankfurt on the design of numerous housing settlements, and I showed you earlier yesterday this image, this plan she worked out for studio apartments for single women. Helena Sirkis, whom I also mentioned, with her husband Seisman, was responsible for several of the most important housing complexes in Poland before World War II, including this really important early modernist complex for the Warsaw Housing Cooperative in the mid-30s. Other women, lesser known, and whom I hope will be the subject of future studies, were actively engaged in housing, often designing projects with innovative programs and collective amenities. I showed you a project, but in black and white, that Hildebrandt had celebrated the remarkable housing complex in Vienna of 1925-26. Think how early that is. The same year as the Great Paris World's Fair. All Corbu had built in terms of housing at that point was really the Esprit Nouveau Pavilion, no large housing complexes. Ella Briggs had designed this major housing complex in Vienna. A home for unwed mothers in Helsinki by Finnish architect Elna Kiljaner, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, 1936, 10 years later, who, by the way, also designed kitchens inspired by Sjoerd Lohotsky's models. And again, if any of you know anything about her, I'm going to sort of bug any of my Finnish friends if they'll start doing research on her, because I can find out just about nothing. However, not everyone concerned with housing and urban development, and this is really important, was trained as a designer or architect. This was true of two of the leading housing reformers of the period in the US and England, Catherine Bower in the United States and Elizabeth Denby in England. As in the case of the women's movement for household rationalization, the Women's Campaign for Housing Reform after World War I had its roots in efforts dating back to the 19th century, especially in Britain and the United States. Maybe there are examples in Brazil too, I would like to know. Here I show you image of the remarkable Octavia Hill, who wrote a series of books calling for the transformation of slum conditions and was herself involved in the design of this arts and crafts project for impoverished residents in London, the Red Cross cottages. In the US, a really talented polyglot woman, Edith Ulmer Wood, played a similar role in the first third of the 20th century, writing books about housing, campaigning for housing, writing housing requirements for government agencies. Lots more research needs to be done on her, although there's a little bit. And the other major figure that I mentioned was the younger Catherine Bower, a fervent modernist who was commonly known, the phrase was a houser. She advised labor unions to build their own housing with better units and more amenities than were standard in low-cost housing at the time, including, for instance, in this very important housing project she advised on, the Carl Mackley Housing Project, for the hosiery union, the American Federation of Workers. It was a hosiery plant workers, many of which were women, that it should have amenities like daycare center, laundry, community center, and even swimming pools. And it was interesting for me to see Patagonia yesterday. They already included a gymnasium, a swimming pool, but there were model examples of this already in the mid-30s in the US, but of course in ideal projects as well. The actual project was designed by Oskar Stodinoff, who had emigrated, but was also the editor of the first volume of Le Corbusier's Œuvre Complète, and a little footnote, was the partner of Louis Kahn up till the post-World War II period. Since Bower's career has received considerable scholarly attention, at least in the US, I'm going to focus today instead on Elizabeth Denby's remarkable efforts to improve housing. A writer, a political advocate, and designer, she called herself a housing consultant. Denby had an important role in alerting modern British architects to the social dimensions of housing between the war. And architect Maxwell Fry, whom you may know better as the partner of Jane Drew in Tropical Housing, called her, quote, the finest domestic architect I ever met. He gave her strong praise for all her efforts in the 1930s. Like many women who became active in housing issues in England since the late 19th century, Denby's involvement with design grew out of her experience helping to ameliorate the lives of the poor. She had a degree, she was very educated, in social science from the London School of Economics, and for 10 years she worked as an administrator of voluntary organizations primarily the Kensington Council of Social Services, where she also directed its housing trust. However, she was frustrated with the paternalism and lack of professionalism of so many charity efforts. And in 1933, she decided to embark on a new career as an independent housing consultant, in which kitchens, by the way, were a major subject of concern for her. She even had a BBC, a British broadcasting program, on the radio talking about kitchen reform and calling for a revolution in kitchen design, which needed the advice of experts and housewives to be well designed, and that architects needed to improve their job. Anyway, that same year, 1933, she met Maxwell Fry, who was one of the leading modernists in Britain, and who had recently become a passionate proponent of modern architecture. And they began to collaborate on two seminal housing projects for low-income residents, Sassoon House and Kensal House. There's an image of Elizabeth Denby, and I just show an image of a very important book she wrote, where Gropius, after he emigrated to England, wrote the preface, Europe Rehoused, where just like Catherine Bauer, she actually went on a study trip all around Europe to look at the very best examples of housing, things like Neue Frankfurt, the New Frankfurt, but also social housing in Sweden, Finland, etc. Austria, of course, the subject of Red Vienna, the interesting housing projects that you already saw Ella Briggs and others do. Although Sassoon House, there's her kitchen studies, looking rather primitive compared to what was happening in Frankfurt, but compared to what was done in England at the time, she introduced, for instance, gas heating, so you didn't to boil water, so you didn't have to use coal stoves, etc. And there's Sassoon House. Although Sassoon House was the first modernist working class housing project in England, and widely praised for its spacious, well-planned units, Kensal House, her second project with Fry, gave the two of them an opportunity to realize their social vision more fully. Denby seems to have been largely responsible for the programming and overall concept, Fry for the building structure and architectural form. It's still, by the way, lived in remarkably good shape, and I felt totally safe visiting it on my own. So if you get to London, it's worth a trip to see it. Sponsored by the Gas, Light and Coke Company, KLCC, Kensal House was intended to demonstrate the benefits of a superior low-cost source of fuel, namely gas. However, Denby and Fry soon persuaded the company's directors to create a new kind of housing that would allow people whose incomes allowed them little more than sheer necessity, as they put it, to experience, and I'm quoting, life as full as it can be. In particular, they wanted to create, just as the American housing reformers had, a more vibrant social community, what Denby herself called, quote, an urban village. And they tackled these goals in two ways: through the creation of efficient, comfortable units intended to minimize the burdens of housework, in other words, applying scientific management to the household. But then, just as important, the inclusion of collective amenities, which they hoped would foster social connections and a sense of public participation. Working closely with Fry, Denby brought to the design of the housing units an attention to functional details, especially concerning women's needs, that was rare even in the most advanced modernist housing complexes. Among the most innovative features in each apartment were the gas-lit coke stove and the built-in radio speaker in the living room. You can see it there in the image. Modern gas appliances in the kitchen, including an instantaneous hot water heater, Ascot brand, and a washing copper. I had no idea what a copper was. This is a difference between US and England. It's apparently a large pot where sheets or diapers were boiled. You can't imagine the labor of laundry in this era. And a recessed balcony for drying laundry. At that moment, even advanced modernists like Mies van der Rohe thought women had to carry the laundry to the roof or else downstairs to hang on lines to dry. But she had a special balcony so you could dry the laundry there, eliminating this burden of carrying heavy wet laundry. Off the living room was a second balcony, large enough to fit a table and for children to play in. And to ensure that residents had a degree of privacy, the walls and floors of Kensal House were well insulated, and the parents' bedroom was entered off the living room, leaving them a private suite after the children had gone to bed. Ground-level storage for baby carriages and bicycles at the base of stairwells spared mothers the labor of lugging prams up the flight of stairs, as was typical in tenement housing. And I still think that would be a great idea, to have a place to store strollers and bicycles right at the foot of your units instead of having to bring them up to your hallway, which we do still in New York. In addition, Denby furnished a model apartment, choosing inexpensive, well-built pieces that residents could then purchase if they wished at a home furnishing a non-profit shop that she helped run. So it was really a whole project, again, a whole way of living, how to have low-cost furnishings, how to have reduced labor, etc. But above all, she sought to create more than comfortable, affordable residence she wanted to reduce the drudgery in women's lives so that, quote, she could free the individual to take part in the other sides of life, the life of the mind and spirit, I'm quoting her, and in particular that the application of scientific techniques to the private realm would allow women more opportunities, quote, for participation in the public realm. Thus, providing collective facilities was of special importance to her. And the project included a rich array of them. She was an amazing politician. She talked these gas company officials into agreeing to everything. A nursery school with a play terrace and wading pool was designed in this curved form, which she thought this was essential. Early childhood education, she thought, would cut the slum tradition at the root. It was open from 9 to 5 so women could have time not only for household work or working, but to participate in the Kensal Club and other public activities. Denby had been highly critical of the physical and social isolation of most low-cost housing projects and believed that fostering of community in such housing would lead to a greater sense of community at large. And by all accounts, Kensal House was a successful endeavor. Just show you some more images. Here are images of the nursery school from the period, and the children enjoying the large walkway around the complex, taking naps in the nursery school. And the other part that was really important to her were the formation of these clubs, where she had one for teenagers, workshop. They were still gender divided. Men would do woodwork, women could do sewing, knitting, have gatherings for tea, etc. By the time Kensal House was inaugurated in 1937, Denby's ideas about habitation had evolved further. She remained firmly committed to the idea of urban life, but was skeptical of high-rise apartment blocks, even those with the amenities of Kensal House, as a solution for low-income housing. Most working-class people, she maintained, still dreamed of a cottage with a garden, though not at the cost of social isolation. And she actually gave the first speech to the Royal Institute of British Architects, a very controversial speech, basically decrying high-rise housing and proposing early on low-rise, high-density housing and mixed urban development. Apartments for single people and childless couples, low-cost, high-density housing for families that would be near schools, community centers, and other collective amenities. And she presents these ideas at an exhibition in 1939 that the Daily Mail, a British newspaper, proposed, called the All Europe House. And the title came from her studies of European housing, that she kind of put the ideas together. She designed this herself, even though she wasn't trained as an architect, synthesizing her knowledge of British working class life, all the lessons she had learned from all her earlier charity work, as well as her trip. Again, to keep costs and labor to a minimum, she wanted to do this so she could improve women's lives. And the exhibition catalog proclaimed it, a house that is a woman's house book come true. And like the Kensal House, it was widely praised by the press. It was inspired by Georgian examples. She proposed a complex of stepped, what we used to call echelon terrace houses. The two-story, flat-roofed, bricked houses had minimal front yards with only a paved terrace and flower boxes, resulting, as one critic noted, in a pleasantly urban and humane street. The backyards, in contrast, were generous, including a private triangular terrace shielded from the neighbor's view, and a garden large enough for flowers and a few vegetables, which opened onto an extensively planted communal garden. So there was the private space and then a collective space. She placed the kitchen at the front of the house so mothers could keep an eye on the street, and the living room at the back so it could overlook the garden. And then she had a committee of women design the various rooms. I won't go into that, but one of them was a specialist, Dorothy Bradell, in kitchen design, the only trained designer. The others were by amateur women, but were very interested in interiors. Denby's efforts suggest a realism about cost and an understanding of popular taste, I think, that was rare in the modern movement, and not certainly common in most of the designs of the heroic figures. She was not alone in preferring low-rise to high-rise housing in the 30s, but what was unusual was her sensitivity to working-class values and her insistence that modern housing maintained the diversity of urban life. Her interest in consumerism, which she shared with other women modernists, anticipated both the concerns of the post-war generation for affordable good design and the appreciation of architects such as the Smithsons and Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown for the everyday and the ordinary. They were words that came up yesterday, and I can't stress enough, this is the side women keep bringing into the modern movement in this period. Similarly, her commitment to low-rise, high-density housing foreshadowed critiques of the 60s of modern urban renewal. Like Jane Jacobs after her, she realized how essential social and functional diversity was to women's engagement in the world. and to the vitality of cities as a whole. And I feel like you're really lucky in parts of Rio to have just that kind of diversity, in contrast to many modernist cities that segregate commercial from residential. The contributions of Lachowski and Denby differ markedly in their formal character and social intentions, but each in their own way, I think, helped recast architecture from a profession that was primarily devoted to monumental institutional architecture to one that was deeply engaged with domestic reform, housing, and social issues. They were not, of course, the only women to do so. Similar claims might be made about Aino Elto, who I keep mentioning, here's Marta Blomstedt, who did work in Finland, a very understudied woman architect again. I gotta get these Finnish historians to work. Gina Ulbrich, I don't know if you know her, a really important urban architect in Tel Aviv, an emigre. But other women were likewise involved in housing, like Elsa Godoni, whose name I've mentioned before, Lotta Cohen, and of course Lily Bright. All these women had active careers before the war, and there's the Platz quote I had mentioned yesterday. This does not mean that modern architecture was free of the sexism and stereotypes so pervasive during that period. Architects were notorious for their sexist comments, and hierarchies persisted in artistic collaborations and office structures. The formal inventions, or what might be called the high culture of modern architecture, still remained primarily the province of men. But I think there's no question that these very interesting, strong women influenced our understanding of what modern architecture is, and our vision, perhaps more important, of what modern art life should be. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. But we should take a break, though, don't you think? Do people, for what I said just now, we can have a few quick questions. I'm sure many of you are eager for a break, too. But maybe questions on the actual talk, and then we can have broader discussion afterwards. Yeah, after the break. Any questions, either on the Zoom or in the audience? I'm curious, did any of you know Elizabeth Denby's work before? Another one of those women left out of the canon. I'm curious here, do you learn about Catherine Bauer either? She's more known in the States, maybe.
Margaret.
Yeah, Margaret.
You want to come here to talk on the mic?
Morning, Mary.
Margaret.
Thank you again for your lecture. Each day is better. Thank you so much. First, now I would like to, maybe it will be a provocative question, but I studied a lot Le Corbusier, a lot, and what you can talk to us about his book that we don't read, l'art décoratif d'aujourd'hui, hein? En français, l'impact de l'expo des arts décoratifs, parce qu'on la regarde, on l'étudie toujours comme une question de style, et du style art déco. Donc, et je pense qu'il y a eu un impact entre 1924 et 1925-26, il y a, comme vous avez encore nous montré, un tournant très très fort, le Domestic Revolution. Hein. Et moi, je pense à Courbet, et je pense donc au rôle de sa femme, Yvonne, et de sa vie domestique, pas avec aux enfants, mais désormais avec une femme, first of all. Et second, la maison qu'il a fait pour ses parents, la petite maison surtout, parce que c'est le premier, pour les Brésiliens, le premier bâtiment qui Monteiro de Carvalho, c'est la personne qui a invité les Corbusier au Brésil à visiter, c'était la petite maison. Hein. Et troisièmement, qu'est-ce que tu peux nous dire donc sur ces projets de Le Corbusier dans les années 20 et surtout Pessac aussi? Comment on peut penser ces projets et sa évolution, disons, comme architecte? Parce qu'ici aussi, on continue à penser que Le Corbusier, c'est seulement la machine à habiter. Et je pense que c'est un tout petit peu complexe. Et tout le temps, je pense qu'il faut penser à ces hommes aussi, Ernest May, Wood, Gropius, qui tu as montré, mais aussi je voudrais vous demander sur Courbet, parce qu'il continue aussi à être très fort parmi nos enseignements.
You're going to hear more about Le Corbusier than you probably want to hear next week. But I'm not going to answer totally Margaret's question, but she's so right that there's this very big evolution in his work. You will see the beginning of that concern. I showed you the Manifesto for a Dwelling. That's already 1923. But he doesn't think about kitchens. He also thinks women are still too decorative, too involved with the decorative arts, embroidering cushions, etc. But I hope in the lecture that I talk about on Charlotte Perriand next Wednesday to answer some of these questions. What I won't be able to answer, which I think is very important that Margaret brought up, is the role of Yvonne, the woman he lived with. They finally got married in 1930. She worked as a model. We know almost nothing about her. She was from Madagascar. She was very striking, of what they call a femme moderne with cropped hair, quite chic, excellent cook. She drank a lot, but she was a very strong influence on him, undoubtedly making him earthier, more aware of domestic pleasures, all sorts of things. We have no archives on her. All we've got are the personal letters between, some of them, between Le Corbusier and Yvonne. So I'm not going to be able to answer that part. I hope someone else will find things that I don't know. But I hope I can answer some of that. What I think is so interesting, and it really requires kind of micro-history, why this huge change at different moments in the 20s. Germany, it happens a little earlier. I would say already by 23 in the Bauhaus, with Irina Witte's translation of Christine Frederick. In France, it doesn't really happen till 27, 28, 29, with the campaign of Paulette Bernège, the role of Charlotte Perriand, and others. There were other women designers that are very important. Not only Eileen Gray, who was a rather private figure, but her work was well publicized, especially E1027. She always had a servant, but there was also a very interesting kitchen with labels on the drawers and things. So these ideas were really beginning to take hold. I don't know that that answers it.
We have a question on Zoom.
Sure.
Let me see. We have a question on Zoom. Sylvia, can you open your mic? Sylvia?
Estão me ouvindo?
Talk again, please.
Agora vocês me ouvem? Hello, my name is Silvia. I'm a PhD student at Federal University, Fluminense Federal University. I would like to thank you for the excellent classes so far. In my research, I'm applying a feminist perspective to the analysis of cultural heritage archives in Brazilian housing from the 19th century. And most of the manuals from the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th in Brazil deal more with educational, moral, and behavioral issues of women rather than recognizing them as domestic workers. And when we deal with kitchens, there's a characteristic of research, there's more directed towards a model that undergoes changes due to hygienic aspects, because our kitchens tended to be full of uses, and animals and such things. And Frederick's functional diagrams, and even those of Lillian Gilbert that deal with economics, they have a character of being of very prominent principles of productivity and efficiency. In the modern these kitchens that you research, what's the main goal observed? Tailorist efficiency or the socialization of technology? Or do they go hand in hand? Thank you.
It's an interesting question, and I wanted to know a little more what you meant by, before I answer, sociology of technology. I'm a little confused. Do you mean the implementation of technological innovation?
Yes.
Okay. I think they go hand in hand, and in some studies it's more organization and planning. It might be the case even in Christine Frederick's diagrams. It's how do you organize most efficiently. But the use of modern appliances as they come into production is also very important. Like with Elizabeth Denby using gas appliances. We'll see later Charlotte Perriand also wants modern appliances, as did Gertrude Lahotsky, but also recognizing cost limitations. So they really they want new inventions, but they also want more efficient room arrangement. So we sometimes in the US, I don't think the boundaries are as clear in French. We talk about Taylorism as organization of the plant, of the industrial plant, of the arrangement. And we talk about Fordism as efficient production and the stream mass production. One is to do with arrangement, one is how do you speed up and make more objects for less money. Obviously, production isn't so much the goal in kitchens. But it was to some extent for Gertrude Lahotsky because she wanted to make them cheaper. So in that sense, she was involved with both Taylorism and Fordism, if that's clear. The bigger goal, though, as I keep wanting to stress, was to make women's lives easier. And we can criticize them for dealing with the domestic sphere and a traditional woman's province. But as I said, I think if we're realistic about the role of women in Europe post-World War I, just to make their lives less drudgery, even for servants. I mean, why should servants have to be running around up and down stairs and going big distances? And that's why I think even upper class kitchens, like Malay Stevens' kitchen that I showed, got redesigned and rethought, both in terms of efficiency, like you said, but also in terms of technological innovation. I want to stress, though, like electric stoves, there were only something like 10 electric stoves in Paris in 1929, from what I could tell. They were almost, the modern stove was gas, as opposed to coal. the modern refrigerator, as opposed to the icebox, really doesn't come to Europe until after World War II in most households. And what people don't even know is the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, opened in 1952 or 53, depending on what you call the opening date, had an icebox. There was a pass-through for ice to be delivered to the icebox. There was still not an electric refrigerator. So this how modern the appliances are, they weren't modern by US standards at all. I don't know what the technology was in Brazil, but in the US, there was what was commonplace in US homes, middle-class homes, by the 20s was not commonplace in most European middle-class homes till the 50s or 60s. Really more the 60s and 70s after the recovery from World War II.
Maybe people need a break.
Mais alguma última pergunta antes de fazermos intervalo, break? So we're gonna do a short break, 15 minutes.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we can
Thank you.